We know that brands are constantly looking to put themselves in the best light possible, but in this day and age where identity is impacted by the brands we use or consume, and people may view us through a little bit of a different lens due to the brands that we use, it's important to focus on how the brands themselves are reacting to this new culture. Americus Reed is a professor of marketing here at the Wharton School. He recently penned an article for Knowledge at Wharton on the 5 principles for brands in the age of identity marketing. And he joins us right now to discuss. Americus, great to talk to you again. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, sir. It's great to be with you again.
Always great to be with you. What was it that drove you to want to focus on this as a topic?
Well, there's two countervailing forces that are at play here that were fascinating to me, Dan. One has to do with the health and wellness trends that are going on right now, the social fitness trends, and this desire to measure everything, right? So there is
Right.
this sort of push into let's put on a wearable, let's track, heart rate variability and heart rate and so on and so forth. That's one element. There's another element that is sort of the social media world where you are forming a sense of who you are as a function of comparing yourself to others.
Right.
And so the genesis of the article that I wrote really was to sort of unpack these two forces that are coming together and that are impacting essentially how consumers react to brands.
Right. And so, how then do the companies obviously have to be aware of all of this so that they can react properly as well?
Yeah, I love that question, Dan. It's a question of the multidimensionality of the consumer self. So a person has a lot of different aspects. They're managing a lot of things: health, status, aspirational things that go on with respect to the roles that they have in their life. So I think it's important for brands to understand that they can't be lazy. They have to be sociologically intentional to try to understand these consumers' senses of who they are. What are these dimensions? And
Right.
try to understand where there is an opportunity to introduce a product, brand, service, or organization that can fit into that synchronicity with some of those roles.
I found it interesting. In the article, you touch on the generational component and how different generations will react differently to different elements, and that is incredibly important because I know I react obviously some ways very differently to what my kids do, to
Yes.
what you do. It's a very unique element that I'm wondering if companies at times it can be a bit of a trap and they can overlook.
I think that's exactly the case. I think that companies need to be aware, and this is another main premise in the article, Dan, that consumers are forming their sense of identity all the time. Now they have these tools that have allowed them to accelerate who they are and monitor every aspect about who they are. So it's really important for brands to be able
Yeah.
to understand that this sociological process is happening and is accelerated in real time. So their job is to be able to go in and say, I need to provide a kind of way that consumers can express who they are. And I need to understand the differences, right? So these younger consumers, I mean, the fish doesn't know what water is. I mean, my
Right.
daughter has just
Right.
grew up swiping left and right. So
Right.
to your point, it's exactly correct. Her reaction is totally different than my reaction. And marketers need to understand that if they're going to send us messages that are going to be compelling.
Okay, so let's go through these components. And I guess the first one kind of plays off of what we've been talking about is that you believe that it's important for companies to look at identity through a historical lens
Yes.
before they react.
Yes. I think this is huge because identity can be often caught up in the cultural moment. And so you can make a mistake if you're not paying attention to the historical evolution in the context of identity as it's evolving in real time. And so the example that I use is sort of masculinity is a very important component in this that's coming up now with respect to certain brands and trying to help redefine masculinity in a more positive way.
Right.
And they're able to do that. Brands like Manscaped, Dude Wipes, they're able to do that because they have an authentic understanding and desire to sort of sociologically unpack what's going on that particular dimension and to be able to respond to it in a way that is good and also robust in terms of how consumers are likely to see themselves.
You also bring up the component of aspiration versus shame,
Yeah.
which when we think about social media can play a huge role.
Yes, a huge role. And the aspiration versus shame part is very, very critical, Dan. And I just want to kind of make a connection here. We were talking about this notion of when Nike sort of stepped in it
Yeah.
at the Boston Marathon with this
Yeah.
notion of runners welcome, walkers tolerate it. And
Yeah.
that's a great example of this notion of you're trying to build and elevate aspiration. You're trying to elevate runners. You don't need to denigrate walkers. You don't need to denigrate those people who aren't trying to get on a podium, especially if the aspiration versus shame context is built in the footprint that you've been telling us for decades that you're all about inclusivity, and if you have a body you're an athlete and this kind of stuff. So this is a great example of when if you take your eye off the ball, you're likely to make a mistake, and you're
Yeah.
likely to actually create this very shameful kind of thing, which doesn't help your brand in any way whatsoever.
You talk about a dashboard effect,
Yeah.
which seems to be the understanding for the companies that they are just one piece of a larger puzzle for each individual on all of the different things that they have going on in their lives.
100% correct. And that's again, this is the notion that you have to take the consumer in his or her or their totality. And so you have to understand that now consumers have these tools. The dashboard effect is basically saying I can monitor anything about myself in real time in the
Right.
context of how I'm presenting myself to the world. Social media allows me to have very clear metrics about what's getting liked, what's getting shared, where the dopamine hits are, and all of this kind of stuff. So companies, brand services, products, organizations, they have to be aware that this totality, the consumer is aware of their own totality and presenting themselves. And so again, the big unlock here is to say that as a brand, what can I do to understand and maybe even get myself in that dashboard so
Right.
that I can help them self-express symbolically, and I can help them try to reach for this aspirational aspect of who they are.
The last point you bring up, and I think I read this correctly, is that it's basically also companies making sure that as they're going through all these changes and adapting to what the consumers want in different generations, they still have to keep their core values in check, don't they?
100%. I listen. I don't mean this to be poo poo on Nike Day, but but this is
Right,
exactly
right,
this is exactly what we're talking about. Why did people have the reaction was, so wait a second, your core value is something different. Your core value is representing a kind of, hey, let's welcome everybody into this to try to get people moving and get them to, in a sense, just do it. And so
right.
if you set forth that footprint and then you do this whiplash positioning where you're suddenly doing something else that communicates something very different, you run into these kinds of problems. So again, the notion is really just try to live in coherence, try to understand historically what these consumers are doing and becoming, evolving over time, and try to be a part of that positive narrative aspirationally.
What do you think then is the takeaway for you from doing this article for companies? And I'll ask you, is this also kind of an ever evolving element here because of how generations will react differently from generation to generation?
Yeah, I love that question, Dan. I think that again, my advice to companies is say, listen, you got to become social detectives. I mean, this is going to
Yeah,
be like you got to diagnose, you have to live with consumers and understand how their lives are changing as a function of internal and external factors. And you also have to have the flexibility. You made this point already. You have to have the flexibility to be able to adapt. Why? Because these things are
yeah,
changing. They may be changing slowly, but they are changing over time. And you don't want to suddenly find yourself in a blind spot because you haven't been paying attention to consumers' identities and where they're going as a function of all of these different types of tools and different types
right.
of technologies that will ultimately help them figure out how to define who they are.
America's always fun to talk. Thanks very much, sir.
I appreciate you, sir. Talk to you next time.
Americus Reed, professor of marketing here at the Wharton School, who I forgot to mention at the open of this, co-host of the Marketing Matters podcast, which you can see if you're watching the video right behind him on the big screen, every week on the Wharton Podcast Network with Barbara Kahn. Thank you, sir. All the best.
Thank you. I appreciate you.